of Bertha Thomas, and she is 78 years old. We're in her backyard, which is filled with flowers. We'll get pictures of in a moment. Mom, would you like to kind of tell us a little bit about some of the important things about your life?
Not really, but if it's important to you, Maya, I will. All right. I was born in Eastdale, Colorado, 1906, in I suppose we might say a one-room home. I don't know if it was log or adobe. I imagine it was logs. The dirt floor. And I was the third of three children. But I am proud to say that my parents and my grandparents were both part of the great migration from across the plains. Some of them crossed the plains later, but they did cross the plains with the group of Mormons, and I'm proud to know that they did. I understand that my grandmother pushed a handcart at least part of the way, and Grandfather Jensen, from what they have told me, he helped her, and he was acted as a teamster. It went back and forth from the Mississippi River to Utah, a couple of trips to help the saints along that were having, well, that were lagging behind or needing assistance. And at that time, he said Brigham Young would not let them start unless they had enough commodities to carry them. And so she borrowed $5 from Grandpa Jensen in order to have the necessary things that she needed in her handcart to start. And then later, when they got to Moroni, why, she married him. Maybe that was a budding romance, I don't know, but maybe she never could pay him back. But anyway, they were married then when they got to Moroni, Utah. That's where her sister lived, Dorothea Runquist Fox, who had saved enough money to bring the rest of the family to America. Dorothea Fox got to come over here with some missionaries, and after she got here, she went to work in a bank, and she saved enough money to, one at a time, she brought the rest of the family over. I suppose they could help a little bit. And she lived in Moroni, and that's where they went. And that's where my grandmother was married. And they loved it there, and it wasn't very long till they were asked to move to Colorado. And, well, this brought about a lot of hardships for them, I suppose, partly because of plural marriage.
Now, you gave us the name of
What?
You gave us the name of the lady who worked in the bank. She was not your grandmother. What was your grandmother's name?
My grandmother's name, well, her name was Helen Sophia Runquist, and
she married whom?
She married, of course, Christian Jensen, who was my grandfather. She was the third wife. He had one wife, Mary Sophia, that didn't have any children, and then Carrie, who had, I think, 8 or 10 children. I don't know exactly how many, but anyway, my grandmother was the third wife. And Carrie they lived in Sanford for a little while, and then Grandfather took my grandmother to different places through New Mexico. She lived in several Mexican villages there, and finally they settled in Eastdale. Now,
what was the purpose of their being in New Mexico?
I really don't know. It could have been that the United States officers were really after anybody that had more than one wife. They required or demanded that they divorce all but one. And Grandpa let one stayed, Mary Sophia stayed in Utah, and Carrie lived in Sanford or Manassas, I don't know which. And then Grandma lived in Sanford, and then he moved them to one place. They stayed in Chama one winter. He got the walls of the house up, according to Uncle Wilford, and then he went back to Utah to look after some of his business. And while they were there, they just put a tarpaulin over the top of the walls of that house, and that's the way they stayed all winter in Chama. And during that winter, the children had regular sicknesses, scarlet fever, they thought it was, and so on. And then they lived at another little place.
Do you think that house still stands today in Chama?
I don't think so. But Mother used to say that she would have to herd the cow. He left him a cow for milk. She'd have to herd the cow out on the prairie, and she got so many cockleburrs in her ankles and legs that she got infection. But she said at night they would, quite often the Indians would come and want their food and want bread, and the kids would beg their mother not to give it to them, and she'd say, well, we better feed them. We can't fight them. And then she'd always kneel down with the family in prayer and ask the Lord to protect them from the Indians, and I guess they were. And then they went on and lived at Eastdale, and that's where she met my dad. And at one time, there were 50 families living in Eastdale. And they hauled brick and built a church house there, and it was a beautiful place. And I've heard my folks say that they had some really good times there, along with the hardships. But that's all I'm going to say about them. All right. Then my mother and dad were married, and I had a little brother. He was born premature when my father had gone to Summitville to seek employment. And then he died before my father even got home, and Grandpa Nielsen had named him Nathaniel, but he was born at 7 months. Mother had slipped on the ice and fallen. And then Leonard was the next one, and I was the third, and we lived at Eastdale till I was about, I suppose, 4 or 5. I don't know exactly. But my first recollection of Eastdale was watching the men come in and water their horses by the well. It was a community well. Everybody drew well from a rope that over a pulley and carried the water to their house. And then they would water their horses at night at that same well. And that's what I remember most about Eastdale, was standing watching the horses drink out of that water, and the men pull it up out of the bucket and put it in the trough. And Holman's lived down the road, and I could sometimes skip over there barefooted to play with Videla Holman, and maybe I had permission, maybe I didn't, but I do remember going there and getting to stay all night one night.
We're going to continue now.
All right. It seemed like the men dug reservoirs and canals to try to get water to Eastdale, but they never were very successful. And finally, it just became a deserted place. And they moved, one by one, they moved to Manassas. And I was about 5, I guess they moved to Manassas. But right now, if you go to Eastdale, there's nothing left there except a little cemetery that has a fence around it. And you ask where Eastdale is, nobody seems to know it, but they'll say, well, there's a Mormon cemetery over there, and that's about all that's left of Eastdale, is that little Mormon cemetery.
How many houses were there when your folks lived there?
Yeah, talk louder.
How many houses were there when your folks lived there?
I don't know how many. Uncle Wilford said there were 50 families to begin with. Now, I've heard him talk about different ones that lived there, the Martinsons, and the Dunns, and the Nielsens, and the Jensens. Aunt Carrie moved over there too. Aunt Sophia, and the first wife, never did move to Eastdale. But I don't know how many there were. But finally, I might say the desert and the cold winters conquered them at last. A heavy snow fell in August, about the 2nd year, and buried their wheat and destroyed their crops, along with some of the other things that happened, and they finally just give up. So they were glad to move to Manassas. And one more thing I remember is going over to either one of the grandparents or the Holmans, and I remember that biting sand. The wind blew across there, and that sand would sting my legs till I'd just be crying when I got home, because we were always barefooted. And I remember Dad saying, people from Manassas, some of the young people, would come over there to a dance, and they'd come in a wagon, and he said we hated for them to come because they always had shoes, and we danced barefooted, and then they'd step on our toes.
Did you not wear shoes then because you couldn't afford them, or?
I don't think they could afford shoes. Maybe some of the older ones did, but the kids went barefooted, and the younger people went barefooted. I've heard when Brother Martinson, Lawrence Martinson, was our home teacher at the ranch, he used to say, I walked all the way to Eastdale to see your mother once. And boy, that was a long way, about to walk up and down about 7 hills for about 14 miles, I think it was, is all. That doesn't sound very far, but it's quite a ways to walk. All right. Finally, they moved to Manassas, and they bought a little adobe house on the south side of town. And Mother was so anxious for us to get an education. She started me to school when I was 5 years old. And I remember the teacher was a Mrs. Jenkins, a heavy older lady. And one day she said, "I'm going to go see your mother." And oh, I was so thrilled to walk down the street with her holding my hand. And when we got home, she said, "I've just got too many students. She's going to have to wait till she's 6 years old." Oh, I was broken-hearted. So I guess I must have been 5 in April, and that was long in the fall they started me school. But I started anyway when I was 6 years old, had the same teacher. Then there was an old red brick schoolhouse across the corner from the Opera House, cat a corner on the south. And then we went to school there for 1 year before they built the new school. And there's a bell rope hanging down the outside of the wall. So we got to have recess before the big kids. And we could swing on that rope if we weren't too heavy. If we were too heavy, it'd ring the bell. So I couldn't reach it, but the big kids would boost me up, and I'd get a hold of the bell. But one day I pulled too hard, and it rung the bell, and I got in trouble. But I don't know what to tell you about my early life, really. I guess that was about the 11th of October when we moved to Manassas. And that would have been about 1911 when we moved there, something like that. I'm not exactly sure. And then Dad bought a house for Mrs. Cartwright that was just really my mother's castle. It had 5 rooms, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, and a pantry. And then it seemed like some of the younger children always stayed with us. Uncle Roy wasn't married, and when he'd come to Manassas, he'd usually stay for a week at a time.
Was he your mother?
They didn't have automobiles. The only way they had to go was either a horseback or a buggy, and in the winter time that was quite a ways.
He was your father's brother?
Yes, he was Dad's brother. So he stayed with us a lot. Then Aunt Ora, after my grandmother died, she died of cancer when she was, I think, about 50, if I remember right. And the children were always, all of them distributed, one at a place, at a different home. And one went to Mary Sophia Swenson, who was a stepmother or half-sister of my mother, but older. And then Aunt Ida took one, and Mary Sophia in Salt Lake, the first wife, took 2. And then this Dorothea Fox took the 2 boys. And he just scattered them around, one at a place, after she died. But later, one at a time seemed to come back to go to school. So Aunt Ora came back, and she lived with Mother quite a while. And then Aunt Esther, and I lived in Vernal, so they sent her back to go to the academy because it was a church school. All right.
Did she die in Eastdale then? Your grandmother died in Eastdale?
Yes, she's buried there. And she had cancer, but she had that cancer for 11 years before she finally died. And she was bedfast for over a year. She was so weak she couldn't even raise her head. But Mother said she only got to go to the 3rd grade. And then she'd have to run home at recess and noon to take care of her mother and whatever there was to do. Anyway, we moved to Manassas then, and in the little house that was we thought was about the best in the world, and I lived there then till I was about 9 years old. And Dad decided to move again, so we moved to the McDaniel Ranch, where I guess it was kind of a sharecrop in a way. He got a part of everything, and when we got down there, we thought that was a grand place. There were 35 horses that were never even broken or had a bridle on. He began breaking those horses, and we liked it. There was a big slough, or we called it the slough, I guess. But anyway, it was wide and it froze over in the wintertime, so that was our fun. We'd go out there and skate on that slough every winter. And
How long did you live out there?
and we lived there 3 years. And they milked about 20 cows. So that was where I learned how to milk anyway. And then, of course, in the summertime, we'd have to hoe potatoes. They grew lots of potatoes, and they were big potatoes. And we hoed potatoes, and we'd have to herd the pigs out in the country. And so on Saturday night, we'd get to go to the Manassas, the picture show, if our work kind of merited it. But we always have to ride a horse, of course. And so we'd go into the picture show, and it was 25 cents for adults and 10 cents for children. So sometimes while Leonard fed the horse and tied him up, I'd go buy 2 kids' tickets. So Leonard was old enough, he had to have an adult ticket. And then we'd have 15 cents left for popcorn. But I'm not really proud of that, but that's what we did anyway. And then when we went to school for those 3 years, we either rode a horse or we went in a buggy. We'd put hay in the back of the buggy to feed the horses at noon, and then when the weather was warmer, we'd ride horseback. And we'd tie a little bag of oats on behind the saddle and feed the horses at noon. Some of the things we did, I don't feel too proud of, but I'll tell you anyway. During that time, the Siegel kids lived east of there. I heard them say they'd hurry to get to the crossroads by the time we did so they could ride with us on to school. And sometimes we'd just whip our horses and hurry up because we didn't want them to ride behind us. And now I felt real bad about that because I love those people, and they are really good people. But we like to have horse races, and my horse is old Kate, and she nearly always outrun the rest of them. And that was a lot of fun going and coming to school. All right. Then my parents were always ambitious, both of them, to have us kids get an education. And they bought a piano from Rash Christensen in Manassas, and I know that piano was a great sacrifice for them to buy it because we were always poor, and we lived down there at the ranch at that time. And she started me, or I think they bought the piano before we moved down there, but anyway, she started me taking lessons, and I got 8 lessons is all. And then Aunt Annis Jensen told Mother that Jane Dunn, that I had taken the lessons from, had said, that kid will never learn to play the piano, but I get paid 50 cents anyway. So Mother never let me take any more lessons. When I was in high school, I took 10 more lessons from Bertha Cutler, and that was the extent of my piano playing. And that's one of my great regrets, because they had sacrificed to get that piano, and I could have learned to play had I been a little bit more diligent in my practice. But I wasn't, and I really feel bad about that. But we lived there till 1918, and then the Spanish influenza, you've heard of it I'm sure, began to sweep the country, and it was really a cold, cold winter. We had about a foot of snow or more on the ground, and so Dad built a sled that we could hook the horse to and go to school. We went that way for a while, and Mother would keep rocks in the oven at night, and then they were always warm to put our feet on to go to school. But that still got too cold. The winter was bitter cold. So we moved to Manassas so we could go to school, and then that was along in the 1st of January. Then toward the last of January, they closed the school, churches, everything because of this flu. And so many people were dying. Aunt Rose Jensen died. Aunt Ruby King died. And almost every day, we would see Jimmy Daniels go by in a little spring wagon, they called it, pulled by a team of horses, taking a coffin to the cemetery. He built the coffins and lined them, and they held no funerals, no church services, no school, nothing. And then along in February, we all got that same flu, and we were quite sick. But after we moved to town, Mother would go from one home to another and nurse the people who had the flu. I don't know just how she did, but she would put mustard plasters, I'm sure, and everything she could do to help. and she'd do that. Then at night she would sew, sometimes all night long, making clothes for the dead. And she'd make a man's suit, the coat, the pants, the fly, everything had to be in it perfect. And she could make the daintiest little slippers for the children who died, and then she would help dress them. But she never did get the flu that winter. She was the only one that didn't. She stayed quite well. But so we lived there then. We never did move back to the ranch. Dad kept farming it, and for a while, till he finally gave up. And with what he had made and saved there, he bought, or at least a good down payment, on the 80 acres that Leland owns now. And
That one across from the old home place?
yes, then there was a kind of a post-depression after the war. I remember during the war there, at 1918 to about 1922, as long as that First World War lasted, prices were high, and Dad had made really pretty good on everything. So he bought that 80 acres, and then we had to move out there in order. Well, he bought a home in Manassas, where, well, the home that they owned when he died, but we moved out to that place so that we could, and rented the house in town in order to save these 80 acres, because he still was making land payments, and everything really went to pieces. And that was about the only way he could figure out that we could all move out there and work and save hired help, gasoline, and so we rode a horse to school. Leonard and I went to Manassas, and then the bus took the younger children, because they didn't have a high school in Romeo, but the Romeo bus took the others. And then I began to going to dances in Romeo, and I learned a lot about the people in Romeo, the Hawkins and the Colored family. And I might back up just a little bit here.
Was Romeo a thriving community, more of a thriving community than Manassas?
Well, Romeo didn't have any high school, just elementary, but they did have buses. And Romeo just had a branch. The Colored family and the Hawkins family and Darnells and Ramseys were about the total of the people in Romeo, but they had a little church there, and Winterses lived west of us, so we and the Winters children went on over to Romeo to church. And I had learned to play enough with my right hand at least, so that I played the organ there for 2 or 3 years while we lived out there at the ranch. And I played for them. Didn't do very good, but
So how
anyway,
long?
if they sang loud enough, they did covered up my mistakes, I guess.
How long did you live out there?
We lived there I lived there about 3 years. Then the year that I graduated, we moved back to Manassas, and I went to the academy, which was a church school, and the teachers were all sent from Salt Lake to teach, and they were really good, efficient teachers. I remember how the things they used to do, and I couldn't help but compare them with some of the things that I know that went on in school later, and they were very efficient. And then I would watch the news, and a Bennett finally that taught school at the academy. The Cutler family was very famous. All right. Now, Uncle John Nielsen died in Germany during World War I, while we still lived at the ranch. Uncle Ray then was drafted into the service, and he was also in Germany, but then he did come back. But during this flu epidemic, it seemed like so many people died. Even sheep herders way out isolated from everybody else caught it, and they'd just find them dead. You just can't imagine the horror that it was, just maybe a fourth of the people in the city dying with this flu. But all right. Now, did you want to know just what? All right, we milked cows always, and Mother always had cows even after we moved to Manassas. She kept her little herd of cows because that was her enterprise, and she usually paid up the current bills like the light bill and put clothes on the kids, and she could have that was her spending money. And the cows were hers, but we always helped milk. We'd usually be milking when the sun come up, and we'd see how many we could have milked before that sun come up. And we always did it that way. Now, Mother had, she had 4 little girls. 3 were born while we lived at McDaniel Ranch, the 3 that we lived while we lived down there. And I don't know what else to say. She'd always had a garden, and she would make potato starch by dumping the cull potatoes and the little ones in a big vat, and then we'd turn the crank, and that would grind them up and into a big vat. And then she'd pour water in that vat, and then the starch would all settle at the bottom, and she'd skim off the stuff. And usually she had a flour sack full of starch that she used all winter long. That was what she made cakes with, and starched her clothes, and made potato starch pudding, and all that stuff. And sometimes she'd even make her own lye to make soap. But we always made our own soap. That was a thing we must. And, well, while we lived there, sometimes Grandpa Nielsen was quite crippled. He'd come stay with us. Sometimes John Nielsen would before he went into the service. But while we lived in Manassas, before we moved to that ranch, Esther lived with us a while. Ora lived with us when she got married. Roy lived with us quite a while. We'd always say, that's Aunt Ora's bedroom, or that's Uncle Roy's bedroom. We had to stay out of it. And when they were there, then, of course, I'd have to sleep at the foot of the bed with Leonard, and he'd kick me, but, anyway, that's not too bad. Description is, Mother was a small person. She and Aunt Esther were the only small people in the whole family. The rest of the girls and the men were quite tall. Aunt Ida was especially tall and rather a large woman, not heavy, but just...
Was your mother smaller than you?
No, I should say my mother was about, 4'2", 5'2", or 5'3", and she was always quite small. After she got older, she did put on a little weight and became a little heavier, but as I remember Mother, she was quite slender and quite small, about like Aunt Esther. They were very much alike in build, maybe not in temperament, but they were alike a lot in build. She had brown hair and hazel eyes, and Dad was more blonde with blue eyes, and we all took after him, I guess, in our hair and eye color.
Well, you're brown-haired. She was darker than you?
Mother was probably a little darker than mine, but not as dark as, darker than Dad's. But, of course, mine's getting gray now and everything. A man, and she could sew and make the most beautiful clothes in the world.
You say she could butcher out a cow?
Oh, yeah. One time Harold and I started to butcher a heifer that was nice and fat just for winter, and so we had laid on the ground like you used to do a deer, and pretty soon she came out there and she said, you can't do that. She said, Harold, put up a pole on top of that shed and weight it down, and we'll string it up on the end of that pole. You can't do this on the ground. It's too big. So in a few minutes, he had fixed the lever that held it up and pulled it up, and together, she had that thing dressed out. And we used to always salt our meat and can our beef and so forth. But she was a wonderful person. I would like to say this about her, and then I won't keep talking about her. Sometimes, as a little girl, you listen to adults talk, and I can remember sometimes they would argue about religion. But Mother loved the gospel. She was a very religious person, and no matter what come up, she would always say, I love the gospel. And another thing I remember when I was a little girl, at the table, a family, just of the morning and so on, our plates were turned upside down. We knelt in chairs around the table, and then after the family prayer, then we would get in our chairs and turn our plate right side up. That was just one of the things we did.
How nice.
Of course, I don't do that, but I remember it anyway as something that I remember we did. I don't remember much anything else. All right. And so I guess I'm going to say something that I cherish very highly, and I didn't appreciate it then, was my mother's love for the gospel. And quite often when neighbors would come in, they'd tell a kind of an off-color joke, and I remember Mother got up and walked out and sat on the porch. And somebody laughed and said, well, Tia won't listen to this. And she heard him, and she come there, and she said, well, you folks go ahead and have your fun, but I don't have to listen. And I can remember that so well when the jokes have been told that wasn't quite right. So she was a very religious person, and if I can give her credit for a lot of things, but mainly teaching the gospel teachings and my love for the gospel as I got older and learned to appreciate it.
You know that little poem that's been hanging on your wall ever since I can remember?
Yeah? Want me to read it?
Uh-huh.
All right, that's just a little picture in a frame that I had bought for my mother by Edgar Allan Poe. I feel that in the heavens above, the angels whispering to one another can find among their burning um, term of, terms of love none so devotional as that of mother.
You want to turn it around so I can see it?
So, and I guess I will put this in here because I'm not going to put it in someplace else. My greatest regret to this day always will be as the worry and the sorrow, so forth, or heartaches that I caused my parents. Because I'm sure I caused them a lot of worry and heartache, and if I could do it over, I would be a better daughter.
Tell me about your dad a little bit.
Well, Dad was a hard-working person, very fastidious worker. He would have his horses harnessed early in the morning, and by the time the sun come up, the horses were fed and curried. And he'd come into breakfast, and then they would go out, and they were ready to go to work when the sun come up. And
That was pretty early, wasn't it,
that
around
was
here?
early. Dale was saying the other day that I remember working for your dad when he was putting up hay, and every morning he had those horses fed and curried and ready to go to work when the sun come up.
Which would be what, 5 o'clock? Or?
And he'd always took very good care of his stuff. He was very fastidious again when it comes to taking care of his harnesses. They patched harnesses at night, and they greased them. I used to ride the mowing machine when we lived in the McDaniel Ranch, and when I come around to a certain corner, I had to stop and get out and grease everything, whether it needed it or not. But he really did like to take care of his stuff. He was a good man, and the thing I remember, you say values, this is one value I remember that I got from my father. He wasn't really a religious person, but at one time he was superintendent of Sunday school, and he worked in the Mutual but he was active in a way. But what I learned from him was, he drilled into us kids, all of us, if you owe somebody, you pay it. And again, don't buy anything that you can't pay for. And if you ever promise that you'll do something, then you do it. No matter if it hurts and you wish you hadn't said it, remember that you do it if you have agreed to do something. And I can remember him telling us that over and over. And I don't believe one of us have ever owed a bill that we haven't paid.
What were the
Sometimes I know had a hard time paying it, but by